Hi, hi everyone. I'm BJ. I'm the genealogy specialist at the Maine State Library. And tonight I'm going to talk about something that is really important, and that's figuring out where your ancestor came from um, when they crossed the Atlantic Ocean. I'm not really going to talk about if they crossed the Pacific. That's a whole different kettle of fish. And those records tend to be very different because of different ethnic groups and different foreign relations between governments type stuff. So let me start by sharing my screen so you can see what I'm talking about. And you should be seeing my screen. Is we clear? Good. Okay. So basically, the issue on this is people think that they can just decide, I'm looking for my Patrick Murphy in Ireland, or in my case, William Patterson in Scotland. And oops, that doesn't work. When I went looking for a William Patterson in Scotland without, I was a baby genealogist. I thought, got his wife's name, I'll be able to find him. Before I looked at wives' names, 40-year period, 20 years on either side of when I thought he was born, I literally found 137 different William Pattersons. And even with the wife's name of Isabella, it didn't get me below a couple dozen. So I had to go back to the drawing board and figure out more about where they came from. And it would be nice if everybody had a nice little passenger manifest entry, and then a nice little naturalization certificate that tells you exactly which little village or hamlet or shtetl somebody came from. But that's not how life works. And immigration is one of the big areas where things work differently now than they did before 1924, which is the era I'm going to focus on, because after 1924, there are generally nice records of some sort. Whether they're available online is a different story, but there generally are records after 1924, because that's when immigration did tighten up a bit, which meant that you did get people who are can't come in as easily. And basically until 1924, unless you admitted to being a criminal, a polygamist, or an anarchist, and those restrictions only came in the late 1800s, if you showed up, they pretty much let you in. Things tightened a little in 1906, which is when the federal government really took over the entire process. Before 1906, any court in the US could naturalize somebody. So people could toddle off to their nice local county court and be naturalized, in 1897. So if you can't find your ancestors' naturalization and later censuses say they were naturalized, one of two things has happened. Somebody's fudged the truth or otherwise had a problem with getting the written record right, or it's in a court you haven't looked at. So let's take a look. Let me go over here and do this. So really early on, up to 1820, you get almost no records kept. A ship could come from France or Italy or Ireland, pull up to the dock in Boston and let people off, and nobody did anything really. There are very few lists of passengers from this point. Almost anything before 1820 is a reconstruction. So, when you talk about the Mayflower, the Winthrop fleet, William Penn's settlement of Pennsylvania and parts of New Jersey, Most of these lists are recreations, looking at other records and figuring out when people got here. It's fascinating reading sometimes, looking at the Great Migration Project in New England, of how they have determined when various people arrived in New England because of other records, where they show up paying taxes or serving on a jury. So before 1820, I don't want to say you're out of luck, but it's going to be other records other than immigration records. And you'll be doing a lot of, well, everyone who settled in this town came from that town in Northern Ireland or Scotland, or that part of these 3 villages in Essex County, England. So I'm really not going to talk much about that because it's a whole different kettle of fish again. So in 1820, we get the first requirements for passenger lists to be kept. And there were not standardized forms. And so different ship captains handed different things at the customs house in each port. And one of the things to realize at this point in time, New York has not become the principal port. You will get people through the 19th century and into the 20th century, even after Ellis Island opens in 1892, you get people arriving up and down the coast. A lot of people did come into New York. A fair number came into Boston because it was the shortest, cheapest trip. And so especially after you get railroads, you get people coming into Boston and Halifax, Nova Scotia, and then taking the train to where they're going to end up in the Midwest because it was the cheapest way to do it. People could buy a ticket from, the middle of Belarus or the middle of Ukraine. Say you lived outside of Minsk. You could buy a ticket from a stagecoach or a train from Minsk to the port, and then the shipping ticket across the Atlantic, and then the ticket from, say, Baltimore to New York. So there were ads in the paper. There were places that had restrictions on people leaving. Germany and Russia were high on that list. And again, I'll talk a bit more about that when we get to these places over the next few months. But be aware that there were countries at this time that were not really letting people emigrate. And so if they do, that's one of the multiple cases where you may get paperwork fudged if they technically weren't allowed to leave. In 1891, you get a new Bureau of Immigration. It had been parts of other departments. There really wasn't a federal overall Department of Immigration. And as we've seen in a lot of records, that last half of the 19th century, government developed into the beginnings, from almost nothing into the beginnings of a modern federal government. This new Bureau of Immigration was part of the Treasury Department and handled almost all of immigration stuff except for the Chinese Exclusion Act, which mostly affected the West Coast, and is just what it sounds like. In other words, people who were Chinese pretty much couldn't enter the country. So, again, we get, 1906 is when the federal government takes over. You get standardized forms in every port. Up until the fall of 1922, if a man naturalized, his wife and minor children became U.S. citizens at the same time. That changed in the fall of 1922 when a woman's citizenship was separated from that of her husband. There was actually a period from about 1906 until 1922 that if a woman who was a U.S. citizen married a non-citizen, she lost her U.S. citizenship. And so you will find in the late 20s to the 1940s, women who had lost their citizenship having to reapply to be a US citizen, even though they'd been born in Kansas or Minnesota or Colorado. But you find relatively few women naturalizing before 1922 because of that. And then, as I said, in 1924, there's a quota system that heavily favors Northern and Northwestern Europeans, allows more people in from most of the Scandinavian countries than from Italy and Greece. So you have that going on as well in terms of that. And then things change again in the 1960s, which is when you get the opening up to Asian immigration, which eventually now leads to the fact that we have a lot of Thai and Vietnamese and Korean restaurants that at least I love. And I wish Maine would get a really nice Korean restaurant, but that's a different story. So anyhow, let's take a look. So this is a pretty typical late 19th, early 20th century petition for naturalization. And basically what happened is, if you wanted to become a citizen, you had to declare your intent, and then there was a waiting period, and then you were able to become a citizen. And so here we have a man named Lewis Fine. Those of you who were here last week will notice that you've met Lewis. I talked about him last week. He's a plasterer. He settles in Philadelphia. He's married. His wife's name is Molly, and they've got 8 kids at this point. They have a couple more after this. And he came over on a ship named the Potsdam from Rotterdam, although he was born in Minsk. And unfortunately, I have not been able to figure out this. I need to post this in the Tracing the Tribe, the Jewish group at Facebook that's really good at deciphering these. So this tells us where he was born. The one thing I would caution, if this is a big city, it may be the example of, for example, I say I spent 20 years in Philadelphia, and actually I spent about 3.5 years living in Philadelphia and 16.5 living in the suburbs. But if people ask where I spent a good chunk of my adulthood, I say Philadelphia and not the suburbs that most of you wouldn't have heard of. So when you see a larger city, you'll want to keep that in mind, that it may, or in this case, Minsk at various points has also been the name of a province, district, something like that. But this is obviously nice, easy, one package, everything's there. But you don't often get that. Here's a passenger list coming into New York City. And this is actually my grandmother and my uncle. My uncle, this is actually a list of alien non-US citizens coming in. My uncle is a US citizen because he was born here, but he gets listed with his mother, who is at this point not a US citizen and doesn't become a citizen for another 17 or 18 years. But you'll notice here that you do get birthplaces. And again, I would caution, when you hear a city like Glasgow, it may be right in the city they're from, and it may be a nearby town. But these 20th century passenger lists often do list the birthplace as well as where somebody is headed. Other times, you'll want to check the headings, because other times it asks for the last residence in the country they're coming from, which may or may not be where they were born. I have more than once found people who say they're coming from London when they were actually born in Minsk or Pinsk or Kiev or one of the other Eastern European cities. They settled in London for a couple years and then came to the US. So that's something to be to think about. Now you'll notice this was done when my grandmother went to become a citizen, they do go back and check, and that's what some of these markings are. So here's another manifest from 1905, and this shows one of the issues. It's very Eastern European handwriting. It can be very hard for modern Americans to read. And again, here's one that talks about last residence. It's not asking where the person was born. It's saying last residence. So that's something to keep in mind. It is telling you where the person's going, which can help you track down other people who are related to the person you're looking for. The other thing that's interesting is they separate out nationality from race or people. And so this is a case where all of these people are Russian, but then they're listed as Hebrew because they're Jewish. And then final destination is also listed. They ask who paid for the passage. And as I said, they try to tell you where somebody's going. So you have going to husband, going to daughter, going to father, brother, and so on. And so if this doesn't give you good data, you may be able to track these people. Remember, people don't do things in a vacuum. You're going to get, what's called chain migration. And, here you have the father came over, and then the daughter or the son, and then the daughter, and then the mother, and so on. Here's another one. Here we have Laser Fiveson, who actually becomes Louis Fine. And that's one of the other things to see is how quickly some people change their names and other people don't. Names were not changed at Ellis Island, period. Anyone tells you that, you can roll your eyes and say, no, they didn't. What happened was this manifest was generated in Europe by an Eastern European clerk with very Eastern European handwriting. And when the ship got to, in this case, Ellis Island, the clerk for the US Immigration Service stood there at a desk and literally checked people off. Although this guy seems to have just made a little dash, although this may be the check mark here. Ask the questions. Laser and his wife Malka, who become Louis and Molly. This SI means they were held for a special inquiry. It turns out one of them had a problem with the cornea of their eye, but the doctor decided it was okay and released them. If the doctor hadn't, the shipping company would have been responsible for returning them to Europe. And so the shipping company was pretty careful about who they let on board because they didn't want to have to spend the money to take somebody back to Europe. And several of their children's records list their mother as Molly Bush. And what's interesting here is they are going to, well, Laser's father-in-law and Malka's father, Israel Bushell, and it gives the address. And needless to say, I've gone down a big rabbit hole trying to figure out who he is. But here they are coming into Ellis Island in June of 1903, and by 1905 in the New York State Census, they're going by Louis and Molly Fine. And they would have made the decision to change their name. It would not have been there's nowhere for the immigration official to change it. Even if they had changed it, you could walk out and never use it. There wasn't any requirement. So a lot of people changed their names, anglicized them, made life easier. So again, here, let's look at this. And we have his occupation. And again, as I said, we have them coming to her father, which gives us another, since this asks where they were from, and they said Minsk, it's actually looking at Israel's family that I'm able to figure out where they actually were, where Malka really was from, which was a little town about 50 miles from Minsk. Here's a nice one. It's typed. I love it. Much easier to read. So a couple of things I want to point out. There is one Chinese man on this going to San Francisco from, I think this came from London. But you get the nearest relative or friend in the country they were coming from, which can lead you back to more records. You get their occupation. I thought this was interesting. There's a woman who's an actress. You get the notations when Thomas John Hewitt went to become a citizen. They checked his passenger ship record. Same thing for this Eddie Roseman. And you get, again, it's last permanent residence rather than where they were born. But this may help you figure out where to go. And what's interesting here, you have these people from Romania from living in one town, but their brothers living in a different town. So I would look at both of these towns for records for that family. And again, it tells you where they're going. So where else, other than these very basic immigration records? Bunch of other places you can find birthplaces, military records, social security records. There are non-passenger list, non-naturalization immigration stuff. I found a lot of birthplaces when you have people who immigrated to the US or Canada before World War I, but died after World War I in their obituaries. There's some town and county histories, church histories, and then Maine has a great set of alien registrations I'll talk about at the end. So here are a couple draft registration cards. One from World War I. It's a man named Edwin Hugh Reed, and it very nicely says he was born in Garlogie, Scotland. He's a citizen of Great Britain still, but he's living in the US, and it gives his exact birthplace and date of birth. This is my grandfather. He actually was born in Edinburgh, although at the time it wasn't Edinburgh, it was the city of Leith. But by the time this happened, it had been absorbed into the city of Edinburgh. But even before this, even before Leith was absorbed in, he said Edinburgh because people had heard of it. But again, you get the exact birth date and where they were born, and you get the person's actual signature at the bottom of the card. So this is after the US Census. This is my next go-to for information. If there were, for any men that were born between 1875 and 1900, these two data sets, the two World War draft registrations, are some of the best records of men from that era. And you'll notice that it does very nicely get us, for people here in Maine, often gets us dates from before that 1892 when Maine started civil registration, and sometimes gets us over the, particularly for World War I, you often get a parent mentioned here as the closest relative, which helps us find people who were born between 1875 and the 1890 census with their family, or somebody in their family. So that's very helpful. Now, here's an interesting one. I was looking for samples today. And this sounds interesting because this says this Stanley Tchaikovsky is from Poland and Germany. Now, that part of Europe, I'm sure we all know, has borders that have been, shall we say, less than stable over the last millennium. So this is again a case where you very much want to go look at the original record, because this is interesting. First of all, it tells us he's naturalized and gives us an exact birth date. And it says he's from Strasbourg, Poland, Germany. Well, I haven't looked any further into him, but the Strasbourg I know of is on the border of Germany and France, not Germany and Poland. So if this were my family, I'd do a lot more poking around. My guess is he may be from looking at his last name, and I'm guessing he was actually Stanislaw Tchaikovsky. I'm guessing he was from a Polish-speaking family who moved to Strasbourg. And so he is Polish ethnically, but lived in Strasbourg on the border with France. That's my partially educated guess. So here's another one. This is interesting. We have this Joseph Puzo, Lynn, Massachusetts, nice birth date, not naturalized. He's still a citizen of Italy, and he's from Sicily. Well, Sicily has an awful lot of parishes and such. But what was interesting, and this is one reason you keep track of siblings and you look around your person. Oops, wrong thing. I got one of these out of order. Oops, I don't know where it went. That's weird. Anyway, his brother is the next card, and gives an actual town in Sicily that they were from. Well, I don't want to say I know for certain it's his brother, but they're living at the same address in Lynn, Massachusetts. They're both from Sicily. I did look up the town. They have the same last name. And so even if they could be uncle and nephew, they could be cousins, but it tells you that these two different men with the last name Puzo are living together in Massachusetts. So the chances are pretty good that's not some random guy off the street sharing a room with somebody, right? So that's something to keep in mind is, look for the other people, because brothers may have immigrated together and given different answers on these. Here's one, Quebec in France. So I went and looked, and I think what's happening here, because he's a Canadian citizen, this is where he's from. And this is his native language, or that where it says race or people on the immigration forms. I think that's what's going on here, is that this is the exact thing. And then they put French because he was French speaking, or from a Francophone Quebecois family. Here's another one. This is interesting. He's here in Maine. He has done that first declaration, but hasn't been naturalized yet. He was born in Marseille in France, but he's an Italian citizen. And so this said France, Italy on the index listing, and which is why I went in to see, what it actually said. Here's an interesting one. Look at that birthplace. Anyone want to take a guess as to what is going on here? Does that look like a French name to anybody? Linwood Millard Corbett. Here's what happened. He was born in South Paris in Maine. Still lives in South Paris. But whoever was transcribing this had no clue, did not have any local knowledge. The draft registration people would have known what this meant because they would have been from the community. So again, transcriptions can be wrong. He's a natural born US citizen born right here in Western Maine. Oh, here's the Puzo. I don't know how that got out of order. But anyhow, you see here, he gives a much more detailed place. And so, but as I said, they're the same address, 38.5 Pleasant Street. So I'm pretty sure they have some connection other than just paying rent to the same landlord. Social Security records. if you have someone who lived in the US after the mid 1930s, there's a good chance they have a social security record. And notice this is someone who was born in Scotland in Loanhead. Here's my grandfather born. Notice in this one, he does say Leith, even though by the time this happens, it was part of Edinburgh. Here's Anne McDougall Wilson from Innerleithen, a little gorgeous little town with a very nice restaurant in the middle of town. I've been there, had some of the best lamb of my life at the restaurant. One nice thing about traveling off season, it was lambing season when I got there. And so I think the lamb was fresh. But again, notice it gives parents' names in a couple of these and the exact birth date and place. Outward bound passengers, you wouldn't think you'd get much from that, but here's my grandmother leaving Washington, or leaving New York City for France. She's at this point, she's going to visit family in Scotland. And you will see this is her US passport number. This doesn't tell me more than Scotland for her place of birth, but it does tell me when and where she was naturalized. So I could go find this record to see if it gives more detail than Scotland if I didn't already know. Does that make sense to everybody, how the outgoing passenger list can have that detail? Here is an obituary. Let's take a look at this. This is from that wonderful clunky website, Fulton History. This is an obituary. It first lists her by her married name, and then very nicely tells us, unlike many of these from this era, her maiden name. And it very nicely tells us when and where she was born and who her parents were and when she first came to the US. How's that for nice detail in an obituary? So that's a good one. This is interesting. This is a family I was helping a patron with, and Anna Kamiński Krajewska. It's interesting here, Polish last names are gendered, and this really should be Kamińska Krajewska, although when it's Vincent Krajewski. So anyhow, neither one of these says where Anna came from. But it does say she was born in Poland. She came to the country as a young girl. And it tells us there is a sister still in Poland, and that she's survived by a brother of Schenectady. This one is interesting because it tells us that they were married at Perth Amboy, New Jersey. So no more details here. But if I go looking at when she was born, I wonder if her brother hits that nice 1917, 1918, if he's here in the US and has to register for the draft. Because, we have these two data points on extended family. Now, I'm guessing Kamińska's a common enough name. I don't want to try to look just in Poland without any more information. Well, I did go and look at the draft registration cards, and there are two Stephen Kamińskis, one who's living in Schenectady by this point, but it says he's born in Russia when the family's Polish, and one who's in Perth Amboy, but says he's born in Poland. So if I were working more on this family, I would investigate both of these to see which one might be her brother. I mean, I suppose it could be one of these other people, but I would start with these two because they're the most similar to what she has. And And what's interesting is when you look at this, for example, the brother-in-law, Victor, worked at General Electric as well. So I think I'd lean towards this one if I had to pick, but I wouldn't rule out the guy who's still in Perth Amboy and maybe moves up to Schenectady a bit later. This is a great data set. This is from a newspaper called the Boston Pilot. And I had so much fun today going through these to find some of these to put up for you guys. And basically what they did is from the 1840s up until about 1920, this newspaper printed essentially lost and found people ads. And the New England Historical and Genealogical Society has printed these in a series of books. And if you're a member of NEHGS, you can access these online. If you're not a member, you should be if you're interested in New England. And if you aren't for some reason, know that the State Library and a couple other libraries here in Maine, Scarborough and Belfast, I know for certain, and I think Waterboro have a subscription to New England to American Ancestors. And some of these are interesting because you get where they last were. Here's their sister's name. So that's probably her married name, and she's in Pawtucket. You get one here. He's age 10 when he left his father's house and saying, would you let me know if you find my kid? Here's a woman who is traveling alone. Doesn't say why he wants to know where she is, but there's all sorts of detail here. Here we have one has father's name and mother's maiden name, and his sister's married name. This one, you get an exact location where she was from, headed to New York City. Sister is here in Brooklyn, here in the US, and the sister thinks there's a chance that Lucy has become a nun. Here's one. Guy went to Australia, but they're advertising in Boston in case somebody's heard about him. But again, notice it gives you down to the townland where this person was from. Here are a couple interesting ones. Here's someone in Portland, Maine. But they're Maloney, mother's maiden name is Mary Marshall. They're from South Wales. You get another one here. There was one else. Here's another one with multiple people. Here's information of him will be thankfully received by his wife. So there's a chance that he's just disappeared and changed his name and left her hanging. I'm guessing this might have been a step in having him declared dead so she could remarry. But again, you get all sorts of details of, here's the parish, the county, when they left, and so on. And notice that their brother has since moved to the US as well. A couple others in here I wanted to show you. Let's see. Here's one where you get two cousins with different names. So again, that may help you reconstruct a family. And sometimes there's an update and they've cross-referenced that. You'll notice in a lot of cases, they abbreviated Massachusetts as MS, not MA or MASS. And then let's see, what was the one here? Again, here's another one by his wife looking for him. And again, tells of, here's a Humphrey Hennessy and his brother-in-law, Daniel Hurley. So this giving you two names to triangulate on in Ireland, which, at least, here you're getting, if you're interested in Daniel Hurley, this at least gives you Well, he might well have been from County Cork as well. Maybe not, but it's worth a try. So this is another, if you've got Irish or Irish adjacent ancestry, it's worth checking on this to see if any of your people ended up in it. These town and county histories, many of them from the late 1800s, but even the more recent ones, but particularly these, you may have cases here where an informant is the child or the grandchild of the immigrant. Particularly for Irish families where they came and made good, they often will brag that, he came from nothing in this little parish in the poor part of Ireland. And now here I am, a mill foreman or mill manager or mill owner. And, the local history is buttering me up by saying nice things about me. So these are always worth checking. They often, you want to take a lot of it with a grain of salt about, because I've seen things where, my grandfather was, the oldest son of this landowner. Those were not the people emigrating. If they were the oldest son of a landowner, they tended to stay in Ireland. But they often do have at least a county, if not something more detailed about where somebody came from. Same thing with church histories. I was giving this talk to a group of people in Scotland about using US records. And so I pulled Presbyterian church histories, which seem to be like they were much more common than other denominations anyway. But if you have Scottish Presbyterian ancestors, these are kind of what you want to look for. They will often tell where the early congregants came from. So, and because in many cases, many of these, it's less true when you get out further west, but when you're here in, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, Connecticut, you tend to get groups having migrated together from either Northern Ireland or Scotland. So those are worth checking into. Here's a church record for a Presbyterian church in New York City, or out in a little town in New York. And you'll notice that it says that the husband in this marriage was born in Glen Cove, New York, and the wife was born in Dunbarton, Scotland. And it gives you the exact parish. So that's very helpful. I have found in Presbyterian records, in Quaker records, in Catholic and in Anglican records, sometimes somebody's exact location they came from, either in something like this, or when a membership is transferred. They'll come with a letter from the minister of the church in Scotland, for example, to the Presbyterian church in Philadelphia saying, so-and-so is a member of the congregation in good standing. And again, here you see these are records from marriages, and you see Glasgow, Derry, Ireland, Edinburgh, Moorkirk, New York City, Ayrshire, and then down here you just get Scotland with nothing else. But for several of those, it gives you at least an area to start with. Obviously, the Moorkirk and Derry are going to be easier to find than Glasgow or Edinburgh, but it's still better than not knowing. These are church registers, and again, it's telling you where the person came from, and there are a couple down here. This is a from Scotland and tells you the parish church they came from, and you get another one here from Glasgow, and then mostly it's other churches in the US. But Presbyterian churches did tend to keep these registers. And I've also seen Catholic churches that have registers of the communicants. So those are worth checking. Now, this is where life gets really interesting. This is for those of you who have Canadian ancestry, in particular, at the start of World War II, actually before the US entered the war, you can see this is 1940. The state attorney general, in complying with various federal stuff, registered all of the foreign nationals living in Maine who were of age, meaning 21 and older. And the reason these are nice, now this happens to be somebody from Glasgow, but most of these, and these are online at the Maine State Archives website, is there was a lot of back and forth with Canada, and many of those people going back and forth to Canada don't show up in immigration records because they're going casually through land crossings. So you're not getting ship passenger lists. And they haven't applied to be citizens because, quite frankly, in 1937 in Maine, nobody was asking, especially in northern Maine. Nobody, you showed up at the mill, you got a job, and they didn't ask to see any paperwork. I mean, the proving you're a citizen to work here is, most of you probably remember when it came in. I know I remember the first time I had to show my passport to prove I could work in the country. I was, in my early 20s. So that's only like 35 or 40 years ago. So, here it tells us, oops, she's from Scotland. She's been, her date of birth, she's been here 44 years. And so this is a nice little, she may have never naturalized, but, and here's another one also from Glasgow. She's been here 27 years, date of birth, and so on. So those are a really nice data set. They're about, something like 5 to 7% of the population of Maine at the time has one of these. And as I said, they've all been digitized at this State Archives website. So if you've got French, especially a French Canadian family, but if you've got people who would be living here in Maine at the time who were not naturalized citizens, but they were adults, you want to go see if they filled one of these out, because it may give you that place of birth that's nowhere else. So that's the end of the PowerPoint. So I hope I gave you, for those of you looking for your immigrant ancestors' origins, I hope I gave you some ideas of places to look that you may not have looked yet if you don't know. There's some other things, like when I get to the Eastern European and Jewish programs, I will show you, there is a wonderful tool at Jewish Gen where you put in what you heard from your grandparents about where they came from in Eastern Europe, and it tells you, it phonetically searches for towns in Eastern Europe that are similar to what you heard from your grandparents. And so it will give you all the, so, if a town had different names in German, Hungarian, Polish, Russian, Ukrainian, and Yiddish, it'll give you all those variants in the results, which can be really handy. It's at Jewish Gen, so it's heavily focused on towns that did have the area in the Pale of Settlement that did have Jewish populations. But if you have Eastern Orthodox or Catholic ancestors, it can be very helpful as well. So I'll get to that when we get to those programs. So any questions at this point? No questions. Did I really do that well that you have no questions, or have I just overloaded your sensors, your sensory perception and you're just.
I did have a question towards the end there when you're talking about the alien registrations. Do you know, did New York or Michigan do those?
I don't know off the top of my head. And I know there are a lot of places that did them and they didn't survive.
Uh-huh.
I don't want to say Maine is the only state where those have survived, but I would be pleasantly surprised if a lot of places have them. This is where we need Sam. He didn't come tonight. He'd know.
Okay.
I will try to find that out and let people know. But there were also alien registrations at the time of the First World War. Because one of my examples I use when I talk about naturalization in more depth is there were women who got caught up in having lost their citizenship because they married someone who, was born in Germany and came to the US as a 3-year-old and hadn't ever gotten naturalized. And here, this couple in their 40s, she's lost her citizenship and maybe never left Kansas or Nebraska in her life, but she's considered a foreign alien national because she has never, she's married someone who was born in Germany and hadn't naturalized. And so she lost her citizenship. And I expect most of you know enough history that you know exactly why this happened in 1922. Because before 1920, it hadn't mattered for most women whether they were citizens or not. But with the start of voting, they had to. Yeah, and one of the things I'm going to do as a special, Family Search has added stuff in addition to the unindexed stuff. They now have images that are barely cataloged. And so I am going to do a program on using those images once I have played around with it enough. I'm comfortable enough trying to tell you guys how to use it. It's still very much the case that Family Search can digitize things much faster than they can index them. So we take what we can get. But yeah. So any other questions? But yeah, good job, Richard. Nice to see that. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to stop recording. Come on.